In this tutorial, we'll be using a new free Blender add-on to turn blank environment base meshes into detailed, fully realized landscapes by automatically wrapping photo-scanned terrain pieces to our base geometry. Here in Blender, I have this scene that I've thrown together with some kitbash assets, and the house looks great, the trees look great, but my landscape itself is looking a little bare. But luckily, I have these great terrain pieces that I scanned with the KIRI Engine app. No post-processing has been applied yet, so the meshes are pretty dense. And that's the raw scan quality, so we'll probably have to do some decimation later. One very important point when using the add-on is the wrapping effect will be influenced by the object's rotation and origin. But this object has 0 rotation, but it's looking pretty skewed. And if we look on the end panel and find the add-on itself, we can see at the top here we have some mesh prep tools to help us fix any rotation and offset origins. In the mesh prep tools, I can see a button here, auto rotate, and as long as your terrain is relatively planar, it can do a pretty good job at rotating automatically. If by accident it aligned your pieces vertically, like this, you can quickly rotate 90 degrees on any of the axes with these buttons. And if I look from each of the sides, I can see that the results are okay, but they're not perfect. So I'm going to manually rotate a little bit, check each side, and let's Ctrl A and apply that rotation. Now I can see this little dot here is our mesh origin. And I have some set origin controls in the add-on. I'm using the Z-axis of the world, and I can set to the lowest point the negative on the Z-axis, and I press set origin, and the origin is now at the lowest point on this mesh, and I could set it to the highest point, or I could set it somewhere in the middle. You can also do this quickly by entering edit mode and manually moving the mesh. We'll see more later how this actually affects wrapping. So now I want to take this terrain piece that has good rotation and its origin is set, and I want to create some kind of walkway up to our little house here. So to use our add-on from the end panel, I'll find the add-on, and I want to wrap an individual object to a larger piece of terrain. So I'll use the mesh wrap planar. I'll select the object that I'm actually wrapping, and a pop-up will appear, and I'll see a warning that scale is not applied. This won't ruin the results, but it can affect things like displacement, so it's just good to be aware of. I can select my target surface, which is my base mesh, and I could do this later if I want, and when I press OK, the modifier will be applied. And immediately something has happened, and I can see this little arrow here. If your gizmo visibility is turned off in the viewport, you won't see this little arrow. And this arrow tells us the direction in which we're casting rays from our wrap object to our target geometry. If I see here I have my target surface, which is my landscape, and I have wrap direction. I'm using the object axes, local axes. I could also set this to the world axes as well. And it's set to -Z, and I check the object's local axes. This blue arrow is pointing to Z positive. Down is Z negative, which is what we currently have set in the add-on. If I change the direction, I can now see that we get a big warning saying surface not found, because now we're shooting rays in this direction to try and hit our target landscape, but it's finding nothing. Not this direction, not this direction. If we set it back to -Z, there we go. If you're trying to wrap your mesh onto a wall or a vertical piece of terrain, you might have to adjust the wrap direction. We can also see that if I move the mesh off of the terrain, we get the same warning text, surface not found. As soon as I move it back onto the terrain itself, we can see that the wrapping is occurring. Under the wrap direction, We can turn off visibility for the gizmo if you don't like it. And under this, we have the displacement axis, which is always the object's local axis. We want to displace on the object's z-axis. And if you don't know what all this talk about axis means, don't worry about it. The defaults should work 99% of the time. If we increase the displacement strength, we can see that we're making the details of the original geometry stronger, but something else is happening. Some of our geometry is actually disappearing. For now, I'm going to turn off overlap cleanup to none, and we'll talk about what I did in just a moment. I can slide my geometry around and find a position that looks good, maybe while looking through my camera, and I can still scale, move, and rotate my object. And if you want, you can quickly use the arrow gizmo to actually control the displacement itself. As I mentioned at the start, the rotation and origin of your meshes will affect the wrap results. While the modifier is turned on, if I enter edit mode, I can see the original geometry above, and I can interactively move this geometry and see how the wrapping is affected. If you want to further control how the mesh is offset from the surface, we can use the surface offset controls, and we have snap sub-origin points. If I look at the mesh with the modifier turned off, I can see that some points on the mesh are below the actual mesh origin. Any points that are below the origin will actually get pushed down when we increase the displacement strength. This might not be the effect you want, so we can use snap sub-origin points to snap any of those points below the origin to the terrain surface. With this all the way at 1, when I increase the displacement strength, we can see that no points are moving downwards. If my mesh had some very concave areas or dips like this, we could play with the snap sub-origin values to get a look that we want. The add-on can also handle overlaps with your target geometry. By default, overlap is set to remove. And any faces that overlap your target surface will be deleted. You could also set this to overlap. If the two sides between the terrain and overlapping geometry don't smoothly match, you can adjust the overlap settings here, including the position of the overlap and some geometry smoothing on the overlap boundary itself. We can see at the top of the cleanup settings, whether using overlap or remove, we have a distance to surface masking. Before, when we had snap sub-origin points turned off, and we played with our geometry strength, we could see that some faces were disappearing. Some of these are being deleted by the overlap cleanup. We can use distance to surface masking to recover some of these points. If I look at my geometry without the base terrain, I can see these faces being recovered. The boundary edges on our original mesh are pretty jagged. And if you want, you could go into edit mode, select everything, search for boundary select boundary loop, and we could use proportional editing turned on, and we could scale those selected edges to 0 on the x-axis. And that way we have a flat boundary. But if you don't want to do this, you can actually, within the add-on itself, snap boundary edges to the surface. And if I turn that on, I can see that our boundary edges are now flush with the target mesh, and I can use the mask power to control the gradient from the boundary to the center of the mesh. If I turn this up to, let's say, 100, I can see that the smoothing is much closer to the edge. If I turn this up to 200, it's even closer again. You can see that the boundary, as I change the mask power, is quite apparent, because this terrain is pretty square. It can be better when making terrain pieces to make something a bit more organically shaped or circular, so that any blending or boundary adjustments aren't so obvious. Now that the wrap settings for this terrain piece are how I like them, I can start to adjust, move it into position, and maybe duplicate the piece to create a kind of walkway. I'll use Alt-D to create linked duplicates so that I'm actually saving memory within my scene instead of using Shift-D to make new copies. I can adjust the scale and rotation so the repetition is a bit less obvious. And now I have a quite nice looking path. At any point, I can select any of these individual pieces, and I can use the gizmo here to adjust the displacement. And now that we've got a path going, let's move on to covering the rest of the terrain using the scatter tools. So I have two more terrain pieces here that I want to scatter over the rest of this white base mesh here. If I can see in wireframe mode, these pieces are pretty dense. And if I start scattering a lot of these over the landscape, it's going to kill performance pretty quickly. So it's a good idea if I first only scatter on the areas that are visible to my camera. So I'm going to make a duplicate of my base mesh with Shift-D. And I'm going to hide that in case I need it for later. And then with this remaining piece, I'm going to go into edit mode. And I'm going to select any face that is visible through my camera. And if I have an animation, I'm just going to scrub through, making sure that I've checked every frame. If there's any faces that are missing, and I can see that I missed these ones right here. So I'm going to press Ctrl and Numpad Plus to just quickly expand my selection. And I can see that I've actually selected through my mesh to some stuff I don't need. So let's get rid of those. And I think this is all I need for scattering. And scattering on this limited area compared to the whole mesh will save us so much in performance. So now I'm going to press Ctrl-I, select everything else, and delete. And now this is our scatter surface. So now back in the add-on, we have Mesh Wrap Scatter. And for this, we want to select the surface we're scattering on. And we have a new pop-up. And I can scatter a single object, or I can select a collection of objects. And I could do this later, or I can do it now, and pressing OK will apply the modifier. But first, I want to put these two pieces into their own collection. And in the pop-up, I'll select that collection. And as soon as I've done that, a new option for decimating becomes available. Since scattering any kind of high poly scan or mesh is very performance intensive, it's always a good idea to add decimate modifiers to your original objects. And if I enable this and press OK, I can see that the original objects have been decimated. This one a bit too much, and this one is looking not too bad. And if I select the terrain again, I can see in the source section that I have my collection. I'm using the Z axis as the upward axis for these pieces. And below this, I can see the decimate ratio for each of these objects. Since it's pretty strong for this one, I can change the value to get some detail back and find a balance between geometry detail and performance. And if I didn't add the decimate modifiers initially, I could also do that from this panel with add decimate. And to really get some better performance while working, it's always a good idea to actually apply the decimate modifier once you have a result that you like, with this little tick icon right here. And now that I've made sure that the objects in my scatter collection are decimated, they have their origin and rotation set. And if I look at just the scatter terrain, nothing's happening yet. So let's move into the scatter settings and see what's going on. Let's preview the scattering, and I can see that before we wrap our pieces, they're actually scattering on the corners of this mesh. The reason for that is because we currently have scatter alignment set to planar, and the scatter method set to grid. This is the default method of scattering, and it's great for large square pieces of terrain, like we have here. And if I increase the grid subdivisions, and maybe change the scale of these pieces, and turn preview scatter off so we're wrapping, I can see that very quickly and very easily we can wrap a whole terrain piece. Because I actually removed a lot of the faces of our scatter terrain, the bounding box for this object is pretty skewed compared to the mesh itself, so planar probably isn't the best way to scatter. Let's try normal aligned. Now I can see we're getting something more like what we want. And if I turn off preview scatter, the geometry is now being wrapped. And I can turn off keep surface mesh to see what we've actually got here. And to make navigating the add-on a little easier while in scatter mode, we have these drop downs so that we can hide any portions of the add-on that we're done with and we're not using anymore. I don't care about visualization anymore, so I'm going to hide this. And I know I want to use normal line scattering, so I'm going to hide this. And we're now just adjusting the scattering itself. So we can play with the density, or we can specify a specific amount that we want to scatter. And I'm going to use density, and I might up this to 0.2. And we can change the scale of our pieces to try hide some gaps. And to make the wrapping a little smoother, if you see any artifacts, we can also blur the surface normals of the target mesh. And just like our planar wrapping, we have snap sub-origin points. And my system's getting a bit slow now, so I'm going to turn density down and turn up snap sub-origin points. And I can see that I've recovered some points that were below the mesh's origin, and our cleanup overlaps and intersections is also removing points. And if I increase the cleanup distance threshold, we're recovering more points. There we go. And if I was getting any very stretched faces, which sometimes happens with normal aligned, I could use remove stretched faces to get rid of those. And again, we can snap boundaries to the target mesh. I can see some floating edges here. And if I use snap boundary to surface, we fix that. And now the most important value in all of these settings is the scatter seed. This is looking pretty sparse right now, and the first instinct might be to crank up the density, but that's going to very quickly start making my computer sluggish. So a better thing to do would be to start to play with a lower density and the scatter seed value. And I can see just changing it once, I get a result that I like more. And if I keep playing with this, I will find something I like that's looking better. And if you see any large single gaps in your scattering, don't forget you can still use the wrap planar to cover any holes. So let's try that now. Let's say I want to grab this piece right here, and I still have my base mesh, my base terrain that I can wrap onto. So let's select my terrain piece, add mesh wrap planar, target my original terrain, press OK, and I can see the results aren't very good. And that's because the rotation is totally messed up. Let's fix that. And I don't really like these jagged edges on the borders here. So I'm going to quickly go to edit mode and just select some faces in the middle, Control I, and delete those. And it's very dense. So from the modifier, let's add a decimate. And that's looking pretty good. So I'll apply the decimate. And now let's have a look. And that's looking much better. And I can scale, rotate, move this into position, maybe offset it from the surface a little bit. And I'd say that's looking pretty good. That's one way that you can quickly clean up any holes in your scattering without resorting to immediately increasing the density. Of course, something very important about performance to point out is that to scatter and wrap geometry to the target mesh, we do actually have to realize any instances. which means that all of this geometry you're seeing right now is realized. If that means absolutely nothing to you, don't worry about it. Just know that scattering lots of photos scanned or high poly assets in your scene is going to slow things down. And it's always a good idea, whenever you're happy with your work, with your scattering, to maybe apply the modifier, which we can do with our little tick icon here. And then after applying, I can remove any unused faces and points from this single mesh now. Another thing to be wary of when scattering or laying pieces on top of each other is intersections will pile on top of each other. As you can see here, we've got a single piece and we've got our scattered pieces here, and in the middle there's quite a lot of intersection and overlap. And in terms of geometry blending and appearance, one piece poking through another can actually look quite good, I think. Like this looks quite good where it's intersecting the scattered pieces here, but it's not exactly optimized. It might be fine for concept art and renders, but if you wanted to further optimize your scene, you might want to bake your scattered and individually wrapped pieces onto a single base mesh. And if you want to grab the add-on or any of our other free add-ons, just search for KIRI Engine, Blender add-ons, and you should be able to find a bunch of our tutorials and videos on our YouTube channel. And the first search result is our free Blender add-ons. And you can see everything we've got available here, including now some free asset packs as well. I hope you have fun using the add-on, and if you make anything cool with it, or you have ideas for other add-ons, suggestions are always welcome and feedback is lovely to hear. Okay guys, take care.